Hey guys, Pat Ryarky here, also known as the Patriarchy. So, John Boyega, Finn, from The Force Awakens, is upset that Game of Thrones lacks diversity and doesn't have enough black people on it. He also complained about this with Lord of the Rings. So, the article we're looking at is from Entertainment Weekly. John Boyega calls out Game of Thrones for lack of diversity. I love that he calls them out. Like, it's always what those headlines are. Like, yeah, man, we got you. We called you out. John Boyega called him out. He's just knocked down Game of Thrones, the most popular show on television. Yay! Everyone's going to stop watching. The creators are going to listen to him, and they're going to cast all the leads with black people now. Oh, wait. Never mind. John Boyega has no influence or pull or any impact on anything that happens, and he could be recast as Finn for the next movie and nobody would give a shit. I love John Boyega, though. Before we go into this, I loved him in Attack the Block. I actually think he was very good in Force Awakens. I wish his character had been a little bit more fleshed out, but he actually gave a very charismatic, funny, charming performance. And I thought that he did a good job of not overplaying that role. I think he's a very good actor. I've seen John Boyega only in a few things, but he's always been very good and likable. I think he's going to become a big star. And it's, you know, and people made a big deal about the black stormtrooper at the time, and I don't know why. I don't know why him being black was a thing. Maybe it's because all the marketing made it, you know, had him in it so much, but that, I think, was just to distract from Rey. I don't care that there was a Hispanic guy and a black guy and a girl in The Force. So all my problems with Force Awakens, none of those issues have to do with that there's girls or people of color in the movie. It has to do with the writing and execution. But for some reason, John Boyega is just ignoring the context of Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings. He's just ignoring all context when saying this, which I don't mind, but he knows the context on a couple of these things that I'm going to bring up to you. One, about the casting of British actors, and two, about the time that these things are based off of. Now, I know Game of Thrones is a fantasy universe with dragons and direwolves and magic, and it's not real. So I understand that. But George R.R. Martin did base it off a lot of real history, specifically the War of the Roses. He went through a lot of history that predominantly involved white people, and D&D, the guys who write the show, one of them, I don't know if both of them were, but one of them was at least a history major in college when they met. Okay, so they're history buffs too. A big part of Game of Thrones is it's taking things from real history, how women were treated at a certain time, slavery being rampant in certain societies, kings and queens, bloodlines, betrayal. A lot of this dealt with people that were white in a historical context. This was not something that black people were dealing with, or even Hispanic people in the same way. Now, that's not to say that because Game of Thrones is a fantasy universe, it can't change that up and actually cast black people in the leads. I understand that on some level, because once again, it has dragons in it. But part of what makes Game of Thrones so engrossing and realistic is the fact that it does feel like it's a show that's showing you a different time and going back in time. But then the fantasy elements come in and just enhance the hyper-realism that the show and the books comes in with the approach. They try to approach it as realistically as possible, as logically as possible. George R.R. Martin loves logic and explaining things out in that way in the books. So white people is actually, in a sense, a more logical way to go about the show, because it does kind of reinforce that, okay, well, if this is an alternate look at history or world like Westeros, kind of like Middle-earth is, its separate own universe, you have to understand, like when Peter Jackson was casting Lord of the Rings, he cast a lot of British actors because British actors are cheaper than American actors. A lot of people don't know this. The reason a lot of British leads show up in a movie like Force Awakens, where the two leads are British, are because they are profoundly cheaper than American actors, because the Brits have almost no film industry. It doesn't mean there aren't British films made, but outside of television, BBC and stuff, there's really not a major film industry for Brits to go act in. You can't go get big paychecks as a British actor. But you can come to America, become like a Christian Bale type, and work your way up, and then you're making Batman money. Or a lot of these actors actually right now playing superhero roles are British or Irish or what have you. But the thing about it is that when Game of Thrones and they're casting a lot of people that are British. because of cost and because a lot of the production is British in the same way that Rome was. So they're casting cheaper actors and the people auditioning. Now, I know people don't like to hear this, and John Boyega doesn't want to hear this. There's not a lot of black people over there. Not a lot of black British people. I think they even have less black people than America does. It's very low population. So, predominantly, most of the actors auditioning and going for these parts are going to be white. Overwhelming. Let's say 100 people audition for a role like Jon Snow, and you might have one black guy that auditioned for that role, or a handful. So, just on averages, the actors that are going to stand out and be more charismatic and entertaining on average are probably going to be white, because so many more white people are auditioning. Lord of the Rings was shot in New Zealand. A lot of white people there. A lot of the British people Peter Jackson cast white. There's only 13% of the population of America's black. And in the UK, I think it's even less, right? And this is where most people get cast, is in the States or over there. And the thing with that is that so few actors are black. Like, I know you're going to be like, what about Idris Elba and that? Those are very rare. It's not like there's hundreds of thousands of black actors out there. Even in Broadway and theater, you'll see a lot of black actors when you go to plays and stuff. And you're like, oh, well, there's a lot. But still, predominantly on average, there's way more white people acting. So just on averages, you're going to get more white people in these roles. Especially when the show is trying to have some basis in history, at least in a metaphorical way. So they're going to cast white actors to reflect that. Black people would kind of make Game of Thrones seem a little jarring, in my opinion. I actually think a black, like, Stark character would seem weird. Or if Daenerys was black, or if the Lannisters were... I just think it would be weird. It's not that I have a problem with seeing black people in power. It's just, in that show, it would feel very out of place to have, like, a black king or queen, and then everyone else is white. But he seems to be ignoring a lot of stuff. Like, Pedro Pascal was on the show. He's not white. I know he's American, who played the Red Viper. Missandei, Daenerys' servant. Well, not even a servant, basically her assistant. She's not a slave. Grey Worm. There are black characters on Game of Thrones. They're just not in the lead roles a lot of the time. But Grey Worm's a very loved character. Also, Mr. Echo, he was in one episode. He wanted Tyrion's little cock. I remember he was like a cock merchant or something. That was hilarious. But for the most part, they cast a lot of actors that they didn't have to pay a lot up front. Like Kit Harington as Jon Snow. They didn't have to pay him shit when he first got cast in this role. Everyone pretty much. The only names in that show were some of the older actors, and even Peter Dinklage wasn't a big star. He had worked for a long time, but at the same time, okay, like let's say casting Tyrion. Okay, well, it's described in the books the Lannisters have blonde hair. I don't want to be this way, but black people pretty much don't usually have blonde hair. It's not that common. So to have all the Lannisters be black with blonde hair would be a little weird, right? And it's just things like that, little things that add to the universe that would kind of take away some of the escapism. Like when Ed Sheeran shows the fuck up and you're like, I feel out of place, because you notice it's Ed Sheeran. It feels too modern coming into this. Game of Thrones is about immersion and illusion. Part of the immersion and illusion would be destroyed if you just threw in a lot of black actors for the sake of diversity while ignoring the idea of the show. It's not D&D's responsibility to cast the show that way, and it's not their job to change how Martin wrote the characters, and he wrote them white. Although they're described as white, a lot of them in the books. And you have to understand, this is HBO where we've had 6 Feet Under, The Sopranos, Westworld right now, Girls, which show I hate, but there's so many shows with diversity on HBO. Almost every show on HBO has a shitload of diversity, except Game of Thrones because of the context applied to it. He's just mad that Game of Thrones is the most popular show on TV. You know, it is right now. It's with this recent episode, 10 million people watched it on the initial viewing on HBO, which is paid cable. HBO's got like 35 million subscribers on here. Then they said it was 16 million with the extra viewing and the DVR. And then we don't know what people were even watching, counting. It's the most torrented show on the internet, by far. So you could argue that millions of people are watching Game of Thrones, and worldwide it's a cultural phenomenon. I mean, it's really hit the zeitgeist everywhere. So in a show like Walking Dead, which is a huge hit, they have tons of black people, even though the black people in that show are red shirts. Basically, one black guy gets killed, and then a new black guy comes in to get killed off. And then occasionally a character will last. But for the most part, Walking Dead is just... It's hilarious how many black people have died on Walking Dead. Like, it became a meme after a point. But that's a huge show. Plenty of shows on television now have black leads in it. Game of Thrones doesn't have it for a specific reason of context of the time and place they're trying to capture, while also adding these fantasy elements. I don't think there's any need to have people of color in those roles, because it would just be for the sake of diversity. It would have no purpose contextually. And that does matter with Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is a lot about context. And a big reason that people enjoy the show is that it's kind of a fun show showing you a different time of the world, while also being a really fun escapist fantasy like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. Even Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling gets all this praise and love for being so diverse. She doesn't even have a lot of black people in Harry Potter. Hogwarts is predominantly white. And that's because in the UK it's predominantly white, and most schools are white kids, and most actors are white. So when they were casting Harry Potter, there's that one token black kid they have in the background of the Harry Potter films. But even J.K. Rowling, she's as progressive as you could be. And even in Harry Potter, they didn't make, and it's funny now because Hermione was black in that theater play they did. And then J.K. tried to come out and said, no, she could have always been black. And the people show specifically where she described Hermione as white, and even drawings of Hermione she did before where Hermione's white. And I don't care if Hermione's white or black. Who gives a shit? But it is funny. J.K. does that later. They recast the play to Virtue Signal and be like, see, she's black now. And it's like, well, she was white in the books and the movies. But that's beyond the point. Whatever. But it's just averages here. Black people, there's not as many of them out there acting. And especially if you're casting Brits, it's ridiculous. So John Boyega, because he broke out and ended up in Star Wars, he seems to think that that approach needs to apply to everything. But it's just not going to. And Game of Thrones is going to stay on without doing that. It's going to be a huge hit, and nobody gives a shit about this. I'm so sick of this complaint that everything has to have diversity. Or I even think Game of Thrones is getting affected by a feminist message, because they used to be very fair in the show that the male characters and the female characters both got screwed over, and now it feels a lot lately like the female characters are just dominating the show and the male characters aren't in any way. It feels like it's like all the female leaders in that show are super powered right now. I mean, Dany and Brienne are about as much of a Mary Sue as I've seen in fiction and in medium. Like, Brienne is impossibly strong in OP and almost has no struggles as a character. And it bothers me, because I'm a big fan of Game of Thrones, but I feel like D&D sometimes pander with the female characters. And I do not want them to do that with people of color. I don't want them to just throw black people in there to be like, hey, look, black people. It goes against Martin's writing. And it's a world without heroes and a world without villains, but race is not a factor in Westeros. Race is not really a thing. Race is not part of it. And to throw it in there, it would have to be acknowledged on some level. Now, one of the servants at Dorne was black, too. One of the henchmen who got stabbed by the Sand Snakes, unfortunately. He was a great actor. I forget his name. Great actor. But he was black, too. So there are black people in Game of Thrones. They're just not really the lead characters. But this is adapted from a book, and it's like John Boyega wants them to go into the book and say, hey, let's not cast these roles in the way that they're written, where they're white. I mean, I'd say that you need to read the books to get a little bit more context, and maybe John Boyega hasn't read the book. So to his credit, he maybe doesn't know. And he's just watching the show and is confused, like, why aren't there black people on the show? But this isn't Friends, where it's a bunch of white people living in New York and they never run into any black people. This isn't that kind of show. It's like the interviewer couldn't just reply to him and say, well, what about the context? And then he'd go, well, fuck that. There are no black people on Game of Thrones. You don't see one black person in Lord of the Rings. Well, he's wrong that there's no black people on Game of Thrones, because I actually just named several black people. And if you actually go with Grey Worm and Missandei, they're actually in a lot of the show. And they're both very good people and good characters that fight with Dany. So there are black people on Game of Thrones. There's just no lead characters. But where's the white people on black shows? You know, I've been watching Atlanta with Donald Glover. It's one of my favorite shows last year, and it's about his life living in Atlanta and becoming a rapper and stuff like that. There's not a lot of white people on that show, because that's not what it's about. Or like if you watch The Wire, and a lot of the criminals or the drug dealers are black, where they're at in Baltimore, right? And gangs and stuff like that. There's a specific reason for that. It's because a lot of people in those gangs are black, and then the cops are more of a mix of white, black, Italian, Hispanic. But there is context for these things. They don't just sit down and say, let's just cast white people because that's what people want. Boyega said in a recent interview with GQ, "I ain't paying money to always see one type of person on screen." Well, I don't care how you're paying money. Lord of the Rings is one of the most successful film trilogies of all time and won several Academy Awards, and Game of Thrones is a hit show and has won the Emmys like, what, 2 years in a row. It won Best Series at the Emmys. So, I don't know why he thinks I ain't paying money to always see one type of person, which is, God, that sounds so, like, that's such a poor way to phrase. I ain't paying money to always see one type of person on screen. Well, I hate to tell you, John Boyega, but you kind of are. Also, he actually affected the box office of this film in China because it turns out the Chinese and the Japanese are insanely racist. More so than people in America ever get accused of. And it turns out black actors don't do very well in Asian countries with the box office, and they actually kept Finn off a lot of the marketing in China because they didn't want to affect the box office. I'm not saying that isn't fucked up, but Asians, yeah, they're not a big fan of black people in lead roles. They prefer white actors and Asian actors. Pretty much on a global scale, white actors and Asian actors, because the Asian cinema and American cinema, Hollywood, are the two predominant markets for movies. So they go off what the population is. Over 80% of this country is white, and in Asian countries it's probably even more than that for their demographic. So they want to see movies with those people in them. They want to see people they can relate to. It's not like there's a lot of black people, don't get me wrong, but on average, if you're talking about Game of Thrones and what Westeros is established as and what's going on, the likelihood there would even be a lot of black people in Westeros doesn't seem very likely in how it's set up. For me, at least. I'm not saying that they couldn't put more black people on the show, but at the same time, there is really no reason to. There's no reason to go into the casting thinking that way or to go about it that way. And I think it's kind of powerful that the people that are the slaves that got freed by Dany were black. That the actors like Grey Worm were slaves and got freed, and then she frees them. I think that's actually powerful, them being black. I think that's a very beautiful message, but John Boyega doesn't watch Game of Thrones, I guess, and he ignored those moments. Because to him, I guess it's because Jon Snow's not black or something, or what, Joffrey? God, you imagine if Joffrey had been black, or Ramsay? There's no way that wouldn't have pissed off social justice warriors. Because you see different people from different backgrounds, different cultures every day. See, once again, that's not really true. If you live in the city, sure. Like, if you live in New York or like, for instance, I just went to Pittsburgh a few weeks ago for a vacation. Tons of black people and Asian people there. The town I live in, I haven't seen a black person here in like 3 or 4 years. And I grew up in Dallas and places like that where there was a lot of black people and Asian people. But if you live in a city, sure. If you live in a small town or certain areas, no, you actually don't see a lot of diversity in cultures. You actually very much only see one culture and one type of person in most places you live. If you're black and you live in a black neighborhood, if you're white and you live in a white neighborhood, if you're Italian, Hispanic, all those things, you can grow up in a one culture and one type of race. Very commonly, actually, in the States and Europe, you can have that. It's not, especially for a guy who's British, I don't know why he's saying that, because that's really just not entirely true. It really depends on where you grow up and where you live, where you're going to see diversity in different cultures. You'll see them on TV and in movies, like but why isn't he coming out complaining about there not being enough white people in rap and hip-hop? Or not enough black people in country music? Or, why isn't he complaining about those things? Hip-hop, which is probably the biggest music genre right now, and been so for years, is like 98% black, even 99%. Why isn't he complaining about more white people not playing football or basketball or these sports where black people clearly have a genetic advantage and a biological one that helps them get, I don't know, these $90, $100 million contracts? LeBron James, where he's getting paid a shitload of money. Let's ignore that, because that has to do with culture and very specific backgrounds. But he can't mention that. It's like, oh, black people really like to play basketball and have a physicality for it. It's kind of weird. Or hip-hop. It's almost like they're better at rapping because it's part of their culture and where it started and their background and what they learn, and white people aren't as in that. It's almost like that's kind of how it works, John Boyega. Even if you're a racist, you have to live with that. You can ruffle up some feathers. We can ruffle up some feathers. Even if you're a racist, you have to live with that. What the fuck does that even mean? God, he's virtue signaling hard here. Even if you're a racist, you have to live with that. Yeah, you have to live with that. That still doesn't change any of the contextual arguments for Game of Thrones, you fucking moron. I hate to call John, but this is such a stupid thing to say. This is him just bitching and just not. It's like he didn't even think for 5 seconds. It's just like somebody told him, like, hey, you need to get some attention because Last Jedi's coming out and everyone's virtue signaling this year in Hollywood, so you need to complain. He had reason to complain about the Black Stormtrooper thing because that was silly. But it's like he's ignoring that Game of Thrones is based off books with white characters. So you could attack George R.R. Martin, and I'm sure he'd have a wonderful answer for you. But, you know, John Boyega isn't going to do that. He's just going to... We can ruffle up some feathers. Who would it piss off to put black people in Game of Thrones? Nobody would give a shit one way or the other. You care, because when you watch that show, you apparently notice there not being black people on it, and you notice skin color. Which I don't know why you would watch that show for that reason. It's not a show about race or color. Boyega previously commented on diversity in pop culture after the first teaser to Force Awakens came out, opened with him taking his Stormtrooper helmet off. Some fans of the franchise protested the casting choice, and Boyega responded by calling these reactions unnecessary and told detractors to get used to it. Well, my advice to him would be to say what you're saying is completely unnecessary for Game of Thrones, like profoundly so, and you should probably just get used to it because the show's been on for 7 fucking seasons and they're going into the last season, and I doubt they're just going to cast all these black people out of nowhere for the last season unless all the White Walkers are going to be black now, but I don't see that happening. I'm in the movie. What are you going to do about it? He told V Magazine at that time. This guy sounds really cocky and like pissy. Like I said, I really like him as an actor, but goddamn, dude, like chill out. Like, just because some trolls on the internet made a big deal. That movie made $2 billion. Nobody cared that you were a black stormtrooper, dude. Nobody cared. You either enjoy it or you don't. I'm not saying get used to the future, but what is already happening. People of color and women are increasingly being shown on screen. For things to be whitewashed just doesn't make sense. Whitewashing is when you take something that is like another culture or race, like you take a black character or an Asian character historically and then make them white. Like that movie 21, the Blackjack movie, that was a bunch of Asian students at MIT, and in the movie they cast predominantly white actors except for like one role. That's whitewashing, John Boyega, because it was a real story with Asian kids and then they made them white. When they could have just cast a bunch of Asians and the movie would have been just as good. That's whitewashing. That's something you don't need to do. Game of Thrones isn't whitewashing. It's got a historical basis of what it's trying to relate to. It's based off books with that, and so the guys casting the show are casting it under that guise. They are not approaching it as, oh, we're going to make these people white to get the biggest demographic. Black people like Game of Thrones. Asian people like Game of Thrones. Hispanic people like Game of Thrones. Okay, it's not just one group of people that like Game of Thrones. And it's not whitewashing. People don't get this. Whitewashing is when you take a character that was already established or should be a certain race and then you make them white. Whitewashing is not just casting white actors. So, no, John Boyega, and I'm not saying get used to the future and what's already happening. Yeah, it's already happening. All the movies, everything right now is insanely being pro-LGBT and people of color. It's crazy. The average is 35% of the Academy Award nominees were black this last year when Moonlight won. Only 13% of the population's black. So they were overrepresented in a huge number at the Oscars. If 35% was black, they were overrepresented by far. And that's continuing to happen in Hollywood and stuff. But in fact, if you even look how many black people show up in movies on average, it's about 13%. And that's with average of population. And they're like, well, white people is like 85%. That's on average of population too. Now, I know America's a melting pot and has a bunch of diversity. But like I said, my Academy Awards example, there's an overexposure of that in sports, in music, in all sorts of mediums. People of color are overrepresented. They're actually overrepresented for population. So to ignore that and say this, for things to be whitewashed just doesn't make sense. That's not what whitewashing is, and that ignores when whitewashing does happen in movies or when it really did happen and black people used to not be able to get roles. Sounds like John Boyega tried out for Game of Thrones and he got turned down and he's pissed off or something. Like, maybe he tried out for Theon or something. They were like, no, 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 we don't want you. And he's like, damn it, I'm going to go complain about this. Game of Thrones features a handful of non-white actors with speaking roles. Natalie Emmanuel's Missandei, Jacob Anderson's Grey Worm, and Jessica Hanwick's Nymeria Sand, to name a few. As for Lord of the Rings, there were very few non-white actors cast. Lauren Makora, one of the few actors of color in the films, played villains and was unrecognizable under both heavy orc makeup and the armor of the Witch King. And a casting agent was even let go from The Hobbit after he published newspaper advertisements seeking extras with light skin tones and told a potential cast member she was too dark to appear in the movies, the New York Times reported in 2010. So also a lot of people don't get this. A lot about this is with is about lighting and what you're trying to do visually. Like for instance, if you're casting let's say some of the role, like, do you remember the orcs and the creatures in The Hobbit, how they almost had white pale skin? So the idea would be to cast actors with lighter skin to make the makeup that much easier and work to apply it. There's things like that. Now that is fucked up to put out seeking extras with light skin tones, but that is probably for specific reasons of makeup and lighting, because making movies is visual and that's part of it. But that's a different point altogether about The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I'm going to more focus on Game of Thrones because, Lord of the Rings was made a long time ago. And once again, I don't really think it was an adaptation of the books, and the characters aren't described as black in the books. And J.R.R. Tolkien goes out of his way to give detail in the Lord of the Rings novels. And yeah, they're not described, Gandalf, any of them, as black people. So, yeah, once again, John Boyega shows maybe arrogance. I wouldn't say ignorance, but he shows arrogance about the industry, and that he's getting a little bit of taste of success with Star Wars. He thinks he can come out and proclaim things and say this without really going into... I mean, it seems like he's coming off like he's ignorant to everything with these shows and the film industry and what's happening in British actors and population. I know he's not. I don't think he is. But he's coming about that way like, oh, yeah, look... he's terrific in Attack the Block. He's really great in that movie, the Joe Cornish film, and I highly recommend that. And I'm not trying to shit on John Boyega, but these comments do scream emotion and reactionary, and it makes me upset because, Game of Thrones is the one show that to even go after anything about it like this, some kind of moral argument or some kind of progressive argument, it just doesn't work with Game of Thrones. It's not a progressive show. It's not some message show. It's not about good people doing good things. It's just not what it is. It's sadist. It's cruel. It's mean. It's brutal. It's the viscera comes from the fact that it's so brutal. And I don't know. It seems like, I want to give him some credit here. I want to say, well, maybe they could have cast, Dany as black. And I'd certainly love a different actress playing that role than Emilia Clarke. She's fucking horrible. But at the same time, that would have pissed off so many book fans if they had changed the race of the characters. And people even get pissed that the characters don't look like they do in the books now, where, they're uglier in the books or they have scars and things that aren't in the show. And this was a book series that had a huge following. That's why Harry Potter in the movies, they didn't cast a bunch of black people, because the book fans would have been like, huh, why is Ron black now? They seem to think that for some reason they should take a minority group and overstate them in a show or a movie for reasons that I don't know, because they have this argument that representation will influence the kids and help them grow up. What character does a kid want to grow up to be on Game of Thrones? What black kid would watch that show, which it's not a show for kids? Who's going to watch that show and look up to the character and be like, man, I can't wait to be like that character in this universe? That's not the basis of Game of Thrones. And I hate to say it, the cruelty that it's trying to show throughout history and the real world that we've done was done by a lot of white people. It was done by predominantly a lot of white people in white societies, and that is part of it. That's part of what it's looking at. So you just can't. It's like making 12 Years a Slave and then throwing some white people in there as the slaves. It just wouldn't work. It takes away from the impact. So if Mr. Boyega can come up, can see this, hopefully he can understand basic context. And if it makes him happy, D&D are writing a show now called the Confederacy or Confederate. that's a revisionist history story where like the South won the Civil War, or it's like the third Civil War, and they actually receded from the U.S. I'm really worried about this show. I'm really worried it's going to be a show where it's trying to say, like, look, this is what actually happened, and we live in a world today where slavery still exists, and there's all these racist stereotypes. I'm really scared that D&D are going to make this show that's all about, like, see how close this is to our reality, even though we did revisionist history. I'm hoping it's more like The Man in the High Castle, where Nazis won World War II, and we live in a Nazi society. I'm very much worried the show is going to be about, like, see how this reflects the times we live in now, which is just not true. That there's all this slavery and racism in the Deep South and all that, these stereotypes. That scares me, but D&D clearly aren't racist or biased with casting and the kind of stuff they want to make. They're adapting a book series that started in 1996. So, whatever. Anyways, the patriarchy. Like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me your opinion. And I'll see you guys next time. Do you like Game of Thrones? Do you like John Boyega? Would you like to see more black people? Do you want little black Tyrion? Maybe the midget from Seinfeld could have played Tyrion? Who knows? But thank you for watching. I appreciate it.